August 12, 1942, Guadalcanal. The air is thick with rot, cordite, and humidity so heavy it feels like breathing through cloth. Palm leaves are shredded like paper. Somewhere in the jungle, a wounded man is moaning, but he doesn't call for help. He doesn't dare. He's Imperial Japanese Army, and in his world, capture does not mean survival. It means shame. It means death. He expects a bullet. Or worse, nothing at all. Instead, Boots stop beside him. American Boots. The Japanese soldier squeezes his eyes shut, teeth clenched, waiting for the end. But it doesn't come. What comes instead is a voice, calm, clipped, strangely human. Then hands, firm, professional, pressing gauze against his wound. Morphine, water, care. For the first time since the war began, his understanding of reality begins to fracture. Across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Saipan, from Tarawa to Okinawa, Imperial Japanese soldiers entered battle with a belief burned into them from training camps and propaganda halls alike. The Americans were barbarians. If captured, you would be tortured, executed, or left to rot. Surrender was unthinkable. Death was preferable. But the battlefield had other plans. U.S. Navy corpsmen, often teenagers themselves, followed a doctrine that stunned their enemies to the core. Battlefield triage did not care about flags, or language, or ideology. It cared about one thing only: who was bleeding and how badly. On Guadalcanal, Corpsman 3rd Class John Bradley crawled through gunfire to reach a wounded Marine. As he worked, he noticed movement nearby. A Japanese soldier, badly injured, bleeding from the leg, unable to stand. Marines raised their rifles. Training screamed danger. Bradley stopped them. "Hold your fire," he said. Then he crawled to the enemy soldier. The Japanese man was trembling, not from pain alone, but from terror. He expected a knife. Instead, Bradley cut away the uniform, cleaned the wound, applied sulfur powder, and bandaged it with the same care he'd give any American. The prisoner stared at him, eyes wide. "Why are you doing this?" The question stayed locked in his throat. On Saipan in 1944, the pattern repeated itself again and again. Japanese soldiers, wounded and abandoned, waited for death. Some tried to crawl away. Some attempted suicide. Others lay still, hoping to bleed out before capture. Instead, they were stabilized, treated, fed, given water, even reassured. For men raised on Bushido, the code that taught surrender was worse than death. This was psychological shock. Some wept. Some refused treatment at first, convinced it was a trick. Others stared silently, unable to reconcile what they were experiencing with everything they had been taught. American medics didn't argue. They didn't lecture. They worked. Tourniquets, plasma, morphine syrettes, clean bandages. Same protocol, same urgency, same respect for life. One captured Japanese officer later recalled lying on a stretcher beside wounded Americans. No separation, no abuse. He was certain execution would follow once treatment was finished. It never did. Instead, he was evacuated. In the chaos of Pacific Island warfare, where caves became fortresses and civilians were trapped between empires, U.S. medical doctrine became an unexpected weapon, not of destruction, but of contrast. Word spread. Japanese soldiers began whispering to one another in caves and jungles, not rumors of cruelty, but of mercy. Stories that didn't fit the script. Stories that unsettled belief systems built over decades. "They treated me like a human," one prisoner said after the war. "I did not understand." On Okinawa, corpsmen worked nonstop for days without sleep. Blood soaked their uniforms. The wounded piled up faster than stretchers could be carried. And still, when Japanese soldiers were found alive, they were treated. This was not kindness born of weakness. It was discipline, doctrine, a belief that medical ethics did not stop at the enemy line. Some Japanese prisoners later admitted this shattered their will to fight more effectively than bombs. The certainty that surrender meant dishonor and death had been wrong. The enemy was not the monster they had been promised. And that realization, quiet, personal, irreversible, changed everything. Not all surrendered, not all believed. Many still chose death. But for those who lived, the war ended not with hatred but with confusion. Years later, Japanese veterans would speak of American corpsmen with a tone reserved for ghosts. Men who appeared out of smoke and gunfire not to kill, but to save. In a war defined by brutality, starvation, and fanaticism, these moments stood apart. They did not win headlines. They did not change maps overnight. But they changed minds. And sometimes that mattered just as much. Because on those islands, where survival itself felt impossible, some Japanese soldiers learned a truth they were never meant to learn. That even in total war, life could still matter. And that was something no one had prepared them for. September 1944, Peleliu. The coral dust hangs in the air like ash from a crematorium. Every breath tastes of blood and limestone. The heat is merciless. Men collapse without being wounded at all. And beneath the shattered ridges, inside caves carved into the rock, Japanese soldiers wait for the inevitable end. They have been told this island will be their grave. Inside one of those caves lies a young Imperial Navy signalman. Shrapnel has torn into his abdomen. He knows what this means. No rescue is coming. No surrender is allowed. His rifle lies just out of reach, and even if he could reach it, his strength is gone. He whispers an apology to his family. Then footsteps echo outside the cave. American voices. He expects grenades, flame, death. Instead, light floods the cave mouth. A helmet appears, then another. A corpsman crouches low, hands raised, medical bag slung across his chest. He doesn't shout. He doesn't threaten. He simply moves closer, slow and deliberate, like approaching a wounded animal. The Japanese soldier is sobbing now, not from pain, from disbelief. On Peleliu, U.S. Navy corpsmen faced one of the bloodiest, most unforgiving battles of the Pacific War. Casualties came in waves. Marines fell by the hundreds each day. And still, when wounded Japanese soldiers were discovered alive, they were treated. Not interrogated first. Not beaten. Not left behind. Treated. Corpsman Robert Bushlater wrote that some Japanese prisoners clung to his arm while he worked, terrified he would disappear and leave them to die. Others refused morphine at first, convinced it was poison. A few tried to bite, kick, or crawl away, panic overriding pain. But once treatment began, something changed. Hands cleaning wounds. Water placed gently against cracked lips. Bandages wrapped carefully, not roughly. For men raised to believe the enemy was subhuman, this was an existential shock. It didn't fit any framework they had been given. Some stared at the corpsmen's faces, studying them, as if trying to find the cruelty they had been promised. It wasn't there. On Saipan, after the mass suicides, American medics worked among the dead and dying. Japanese soldiers, civilians, women, children. The scenes were unbearable. Yet even there, corpsmen treated wounded Japanese soldiers who had survived jumps from cliffs or grenade blasts meant for themselves. One corpsman recalled holding pressure on a Japanese officer's wound, while the man kept whispering the same words over and over. Why? There was no easy answer. U.S. medical training drilled one principle above all others: triage is blind. You treat the most critical first. Rank doesn't matter. Nationality doesn't matter. Only life. That principle collided head-on with Japanese wartime ideology. For Imperial troops, medical care from the enemy wasn't just unexpected, it was destabilizing. It undermined everything they had been told about honor, surrender, and the nature of the war itself. Interrogators later noticed something strange. Japanese prisoners who had been treated by American medics were often more cooperative, not out of fear, but out of confusion and gratitude. Some even apologized for fighting. "I was wrong," one prisoner admitted. "We were lied to." Not all reactions were immediate. Some prisoners took weeks to accept that they were not going to be executed. They flinched at sudden movements. They slept lightly, expecting nighttime killings that never came. Slowly, reality replaced indoctrination. On Okinawa, the scale was enormous. Tens of thousands wounded. Corpsmen worked until their hands shook uncontrollably. They reused bandages. They collapsed beside stretchers. They treated enemy soldiers while shells fell around them. No cameras recorded these moments. No speeches celebrated them. But for the Japanese soldiers who lived through it, these acts left permanent scars, not of pain, but of memory. After the war, during repatriation and interviews, Japanese veterans spoke quietly about American medics, not with hatred, not even with resentment, with respect. Some said it haunted them more than the fighting, because it forced them to confront a painful truth. The enemy they had dehumanized had shown them humanity when their own system had abandoned them. In a war where surrender was forbidden, American corpsmen offered something radical: a chance to live. And for many Japanese soldiers, that was the moment the war truly ended, not with surrender papers or prison camps, but with a pair of hands pressing gauze into a wound and refusing to let them die. Winter 1945. A temporary prisoner compound somewhere in the Central Pacific. The fighting has moved on, but the war has not released its grip yet. Barbed wire hums softly in the wind. Inside a canvas medical tent, the smell is antiseptic, sweat, and damp earth. A Japanese infantry sergeant sits upright on a cot. His left arm is gone below the elbow. The stump is cleanly dressed. He watches everything, every movement, every sound. Across from him, an American Navy corpsman replaces bandages on another patient, also Japanese. The corpsman's hands move automatically, now muscle memory carved by months of chaos. He does not rush. He does not hesitate. The sergeant finally speaks. His voice is hoarse. "Why do you do this?" The corpsman looks up, surprised, not by the question, but by how many times he's heard it before. He doesn't answer right away. He tightens a knot, checks circulation, then meets the man's eyes. "Because you're hurt," he says, "that's all." For many Japanese prisoners, the war did not truly end with capture. It ended here, in moments like this, in the slow realization that the enemy they had been warned about, feared since childhood, was not behaving as expected. In debriefings after the war, Allied intelligence officers noticed a pattern. Japanese POWs who had passed through American medical care spoke differently. Their tone changed. Their posture softened. Some struggled to reconcile what they had experienced with what they had believed. One former Imperial Army lieutenant later wrote that being treated by American medics destroyed the image of the enemy faster than any defeat on the battlefield. That destruction was quiet. It came not through force, but through contradiction. On islands like Leyte and Okinawa, U.S. medical tents became strange crossroads of humanity. Wounded Marines groaned beside wounded Japanese soldiers. Blood soaked the same floors. Morphine syringes did not discriminate. The same shouted commands, plasma, pressure here, hold on, were given to men in different uniforms. Some Japanese soldiers initially refused treatment outright. They pulled away, spit, cursed. A few attempted suicide even after capture, convinced survival was dishonor. Corpsmen were trained for this too. They restrained when necessary, sedated when unavoidable, preserved life even when it was resisted. And sometimes they simply sat with them. One corpsman recalled sitting through the night beside a Japanese private who had lost both legs. The man stared at the tent ceiling, unmoving, hours passing in silence. Just before dawn, he finally whispered, "I thought Americans killed the wounded." The corpsman answered softly, "Someone lied to you." That sentence echoed long after the war. Back in Japan, survivors carried these memories home. They were rarely spoken of openly at first. The shame of surrender still hung heavy. But among veterans, stories circulated, quietly, about American medics who bandaged wounds, shared cigarettes, even bowed politely after treatment. These stories were unsettling. They complicated the narrative of total hatred. They introduced moral ambiguity into a war that had demanded absolute certainty. For American corpsmen, there was no ceremony, no medals for treating enemy wounded. Many never spoke of it at all. To them, it was simply the job, the oath, the rule drilled into them before they ever stepped onto a beach under fire. Save the one who can be saved. Years later, at veterans' reunions, some corpsmen admitted those moments stayed with them more than the fighting, more than the explosions, because in those moments, surrounded by death, they had chosen something fragile. Humanity. In a conflict defined by brutality, by bayonets, flamethrowers, and no-quarter fighting, the actions of American medics created a quiet countercurrent, one that did not win headlines, one that did not end the war. But it changed lives. For the Japanese soldiers who expected execution and received care, the experience shattered propaganda more effectively than any leaflet dropped from the sky. It planted a question that could never be unasked. If the enemy could show mercy, what else had they been wrong about? That question lingered long after the guns fell silent. And for many, it was the first step toward a different understanding of the war and of the world beyond it. Spring 1946. Yokohama Harbor is gray and still. The war is over, but its weight lingers in every movement, every silence. A former Imperial Army corporal steps off a repatriation transport, his body thin, his gait uneven. Beneath his civilian jacket, scars cross his torso, souvenirs of an island he never thought he would leave alive. Months earlier, those wounds had been cleaned, stitched, and dressed by American hands. He pauses on the pier, watching U.S. medical personnel unload supplies nearby. They move with the same calm efficiency he remembers from the field hospital. The sight unsettles him, not with fear, but with memory. During the war, Japanese soldiers were taught that capture meant disgrace and death. Medical care from the enemy was a lie told to weaken resolve. Yet for thousands who survived Guadalcanal, Saipan, Peleliu, and Okinawa, reality contradicted doctrine in the most intimate way possible, through touch, through care, through survival. This contradiction demanded a reckoning. In post-war interviews conducted by Japanese newspapers and Allied occupation authorities, veterans struggled to articulate what American medical treatment had done to them psychologically. Many described it as more disorienting than defeat. Battle you could understand. Loss you could rationalize. But mercy from an enemy, that cut deeper. One former NCO admitted that while recovering in an American medical ward, he began listening to English, not for intelligence, not for escape, simply to understand the people who had refused to let him die. He watched how corpsmen joked with one another, how they spoke gently to the wounded regardless of uniform. It made the war feel smaller, and the lie feel enormous. For the American corpsmen, occupation duty brought its own strange emotions. Some encountered former patients on the streets of Japanese cities, men who bowed deeply, awkwardly, unsure how to express gratitude across a language barrier. Others received letters years later, translated carefully, thanking them for returning a life that had been surrendered. These moments were never official. They appeared nowhere in after-action reports, but they mattered. They mattered because they revealed something the war had tried to erase, that even in total conflict, choices remained. In training manuals, U.S. Navy medical doctrine was clinical, triage, priority of care, preservation of manpower. But on the ground, those principles became something else. a moral stance taken under fire without applause. And the Japanese soldiers noticed. Some later became doctors, nurses, teachers. A few joined Japan's post-war medical institutions, carrying with them a memory of battlefield medicine that valued life without conditions. They did not all admire America. They did not all forgive the war. But they remembered. In a 1960s oral history project, a former Japanese army medic spoke openly about the moment he realized the war he had fought was built on falsehoods. It was not when Japan surrendered. It was not when Hiroshima fell. It was when an American corpsman treated his wounded comrade first, before tending to an American Marine bleeding nearby. That, he said, is when I understood we had lost something long before we lost the war. The Pacific War was brutal beyond measure. It consumed islands, civilizations, generations. But within that darkness, small acts of care created ripples that outlived the conflict itself. They challenged propaganda. They humanized the enemy. They planted the seeds of reconciliation before surrender was even signed. And for the Japanese soldiers who survived because an American medic refused to see an enemy, only a wounded man, the meaning of the war was forever changed. Not by force, not by victory, but by mercy.